an expansion of the first one. You may remember the first one, the origin and destiny of humanness. This is also about the gospel according to Matthew. But there's something very unique about this book. Unique in the sense that so far as I've been able to determine, nothing like it has appeared in print in biblical scholarship. What makes it unusual is that it attempts to offer the reader an experience. It is not a commentary. It does not attempt to comment on the biblical text. Philosophically speaking, experience is prior to analysis. And most, if not all, the commentaries that are produced in biblical scholarship today work analysis. That is, they bracket what philosophically is called the a priori understanding. That gets bracketed. It's too subjective. And they move into a posteriori analysis. And what is produced is information. Nothing personal, just information. What I've tried to do is to write a very personal book, but one that is both subjective and objective. So all the footnotes are in the back of the book, not at the bottom of each page. And it is hoped that this performance which I'm offering, and that's technically what I call it, a performance. In fact, I use the analogy of a symphony conductor who spends time studying the score of a musical composition and then proceeds to conduct an orchestra according to his interpretation of the symphonic composition. And that's what I've tried to do, using both objective and subjective hermeneutics. And I hope it will catch on. So far, I've not encountered any kind of a review, but maybe there'll be one forthcoming in the near future. The reason for this is an event that took place in the second year of my teaching here at the seminary, back in 1964. There were 3 Swiss scholarship students here at the time from the University of Zurich. And they took a course from me in 1 Corinthians. We were on a quarter system in those days. And at the end of the course, they invited me here to the dining hall, bought me a cup of coffee, and proceeded to tell me it was the worst course they had ever experienced in their lives. They qualified that by saying, in as far as I shared with them what I thought that Paul had said 2,000 years ago, that was acceptable. The problem was I never brought it into the 20th century. And I realized how right they were. And that was the beginning of a hermeneutical journey. Initially, I used literature to try to interpret the biblical text for the 20th century. I had a lot of fun doing that. And I still enjoy doing literature. But that wasn't enough. And gradually I worked my way through some of the philosophical texts, particularly Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, and Hans-Georg Gadamer's Truth and Method, and all the writings of a French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur. That has brought me to where I am today. And what I want to present to you, put in front of you today, I still have lots of problems. That became very obvious in working through Matthew. Let me give you at least one example, if not more. Here in Matthew chapter 14, we read the story of Jesus feeding the multitudes and then sending his disciples off across the lake. The Greek text literally says he compelled them to get into the boat. Force is necessary because they are aware that Jesus is not going to accompany them. They remember what happened earlier when he was with them in the boat. He could stand up and calm the wind and the sea, but now they're out alone. This is Jesus pushing his fledglings out of the nest. Soon they're going to have to go, quote, before him. He's not going to be their pioneer anymore. They will be the pioneers. They will have to make the big decisions. But here we have an English translation that does not correspond to the Greek text. Here's what it says. Jesus appears to them in the fourth watch of the night, walking on the Sea of Galilee. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear, but immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Don't be afraid." And we move on. Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, came toward Jesus. Period. He didn't start sinking or drowning right away. He's successful. But then, as the text says, he noticed the strong wind and he became frightened, overwhelmed by the chaos of the sea and the wind. And so he sinks, and Jesus has to rescue him. Up to the time that I used the last commentary on Matthew before I published my book on Matthew, every single book, every single commentary focused on Jesus rescuing Peter from drowning. That corresponds to the English translation. But what the Greek text literally says, "Be enheartened," or "be of good cheer," ego eimi. I am, not it is I. In Greek, if one wants to say it is I or I am he, the copula eimi is enough. That in and of itself says I am or it is I. This is a divine formula that goes all the way back to Exodus chapter 4 in the Septuagint text. So Jesus is pulling off a divine stunt. And what Peter says to him then is different than what the English translation says. He says, "Lord, if you are." If you are what? Lord, if you are, I am. In other words, Peter is recognizing this divine formula. Then command me to come to you on the waters, and Jesus urges him to join him. What does that have to do with Christianity? What must lay people do when they come to this English translation of the New RSV and the RSV and the NIV and virtually every other English translation that does not do justice to the Greek text? What is a pastor supposed to do? You've gone to the seminary, maybe you've heard a lecture or so of mine on Matthew in which I dealt with this text. What happens when you go into the parish and you work with the translations and you, on the other hand, have the memory of a professor say something quite different than the translations? What is to happen? It raises the question all over again, what is Christianity? Let me give you one or two more examples. In John chapter 14, verse 12, Jesus says something very startling, something very radical. "Amen, amen, I say to you, the works that I do, you will do, and greater works than these you will do, because I go to the Father." When Have you ever preached on that? I've never heard a sermon on that. And one more example in chapter 9, where Jesus heals a human being, a male probably born blind. He spits on the ground, makes a little paste. He's already breaking the Sabbath by mixing, because on the Sabbath you're not allowed to mix anything at all. And he wipes it in the man's eyes and tells him to go and take a bath in the pool of Siloam. He does, and when he returns, there's a problem. His friends aren't sure this is the same person they knew before. That's why they speculate about his identity. Is he or is he not? And he comes forward and says, "Hey, go at me!" And the English translation of the New RSV says, "I am the man." Man, anthropos is not in the text at all. How can they translate, "I am the man," and say, "Go at me"? What is the evangelist trying to communicate here? Here is someone who has been reduced as a result of his baptism to nothing except I am, a pure I am, without any predicates. He can no longer say, "I'm a blind man," because that's in the past. His baptism has left that behind. All he is now is simply a naked I am, and he must now decide what new predicates he's going to add to the I am. And in the classes that I've taught on that, I've always said, why not try I am the resurrection and the life? That's a new predicate. I am the light of the world. I'm the bread of life. How about I am the way, the truth, and the life? What is Christianity all about anyway? All these years in which I've taught, I've emphasized a horizontality of the relationship we have with God and Jesus. And it's never caught on. I don't know how you preached. I'm not sitting in judgment on you. I simply don't hear that anywhere. And I've been all over Africa, 4 sabbatical leaves in Africa. And I haven't encountered it there either, even though I've tried to introduce it. But you see, the verticality of the relationship to God and Jesus is so prevalent, so powerful, and so old, it can't be changed. In working through Matthew, I struggled with the number 2. 2. Very, very interesting occurrence of the number 2. You are probably most familiar with the 21st chapter in which Jesus rides into Jerusalem on 2 jackasses at the same time. Actually, they're not 2 jackasses. One is a donkey and the other is a pack animal. And all the commentaries say the evangelist misunderstood the poetic parallelism of Zechariah 9:9. Well, that's one explanation. But what I learned, and I already published this back in the 1970s in that first book, behind Matthew is this apocalyptic work of 2nd Baruch. Nobody pays much attention to that. In fact, biblical scholarship generally puts it at the end of the 1st century, and I've learned that the author of Matthew was very familiar with that book. And in presenting the genealogy of Jesus in chapter 1, and that's where the secret of the whole gospel lies, he divided the genealogy into what appears to be 3 divisions of 14. And in fact, chapter 1, verse 14 says precisely that. 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the Babylonian captivity, not a person but an event, and 14 from the Babylonian captivity to the Christ. Actually, there are only 12 names in the 3rd division of the genealogy. Nevertheless, every single commentary ignores that and explains the 3 times 14 on the basis of the numerical value of the 3 consonants of the name David in Hebrew. Dalet is 4, Vav is 6, and Dalet is 4. We have a total number of 14. That explains the genealogy, but nobody ever bothers to count. I'm serious about that because I worked through a 3-volume commentary in which my essay on this very genealogy is cited, and it's totally dismissed. Going back to the numerical explanation of the 3 times 14. No, 2 is there. Jesus is the 13th and the 14th. And the second Baruch will explain what the significance of that is. 13, the number 13 is the end of the present moral order, the great catastrophe in which the creation is reduced to its primordial chaos. And then 14 is resurrection. And that works itself out very nicely in Matthew, but no one seems to pay much attention to that. The 13th occurs when Jesus is dying on the cross, and the evangelist tells us, Hege esese, the earth was quaked, the earth was shaken, and the rocks were split apart. There's your 13th episode, the reduction of the creation to its primordial chaos, followed immediately by resurrection. The graves were opened. So this is my problem. This is what I'm still struggling to pursue. What is Christianity? Is it a hierarchical relationship to Jesus and to God? In Matthew, I encountered something I haven't particularly paid much attention to, chapter 10, verse 28, where Jesus says, "Don't be afraid of those who kill the body but are not able to kill the soul. Be rather afraid of the one who can kill both soul and body in Gehenna." There's an anthropology. There's an anthropology that stands in stark relationship to Greek anthropology, which is one that splits soul and body into 2 different beings. In fact, the French philosopher René Descartes regarded the soul to be one being and the physical body to be another being, and ended up explaining the human being as 2 different beings at the same time rather than one being. That little observation was affirmed by a memory of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 through 5, where Paul is explaining to the Greek Corinthians, and I want to emphasize the word Greek because they are embedded in Greek anthropology that splits soul and body into 2 different parts. May not be 2 different beings, but nevertheless, usually the soul has being, but the body doesn't have being because the body eventually dies, in antiquity, the soul is immortal and goes off into eternity somewhere to rejoin its primordial origin. So I decided it was necessary to look into anthropological structures. In fact, I got accustomed to talking about ontology. That's not easy to talk about because I guess a lot of people don't know exactly what ontology means or what it's all about. But in any case, maybe more can be said about that. But I went back to Genesis 2. Not Genesis 1. Genesis 2 is the older of the 2 creation myths. Of course, we're all familiar with that. We've learned that at seminary. But there's something very distinctive about the J strand of Genesis 2. And I think that Bob Coot and Margaret have done a good job in teaching the different strands that constitute the Pentateuch. That right now is all up for grabs. And I've talked to my old colleague Bob Coot recently, and he's a little distressed. You know, he wrote books about these different strands. I think they're still very valid, although in Europe the scene is quite different, and no one exactly knows what to do with those strands. But anyway, I find them meaningful too, and I'm inclined to validate what Bob has done in his book. But Genesis 2:4b is the beginning of this myth, and it prioritizes the creation of the earth, not the heavens. That's Genesis 1. Moreover, the first creation that occurs, in fact, Genesis 2 presupposes there's already a world that's present, a universe of some kind, because, well, let me read the text. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for Yahweh God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no one to till the ground. Interesting picture that's being developed here. And a stream would rise from the earth and would water the whole face of the ground. There's irrigation taking place even before a human being is created. Now, keep in mind, in Genesis 1, we don't get to the creation of human beings until the 6th day. Here, the author goes on to say, and then Yahweh God formed Adamah, formed Adam from dirt. Adam is dirt, ground. And breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and Adam became a nefesh chaya, a living being. How do we conceptualize that? I forgot to urge you to get a handout. If you don't have a handout, someone could distribute them. I want you to look at these two figures, because what we're going to be talking about now is based on these two representations of ontology. I'm not sure I've named them as appropriately as these could be named, but I have one called After the Fall Ontology, which is a hierarchical structure. We'll talk about that in a moment, but turn over to what I call Creation Ontology. This is how I represent Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. Yahweh takes dirt from the ground, shapes it into a human being, and breathes a breath of life into it, and out comes a living human being. What I've tried to represent there is the union of this polarity. I want to emphasize polarity because there's opposition here between the soul and the body. And the opposition is focused on the determining factors of these two parts of the human being. When I use the phrase parts, I want to be sure that that word is not misunderstood. This is a union, not a separation. It means that the soul is not in the belly of a human being or in the body of a human being. The soul is the life that is given to the body. In other words, nephesh is the life that the body has. Don't separate the nephesh from the basar, the flesh. They are united, but they are to be differentiated, but not separated. This, I am convinced, is the Hebrew structure of the human being. And it stands in stark contrast to everything that the church has said for the last 2,000 years. This is the ontological structure of the human being that the church has forgotten, the church has neglected, the church has lost. What this is like is analogous to discovering a new planet out there in the universe. That's how radical this thing is. And look at the determinants of this polarity. The determinant of the soul is imagination. And imagination enables us to become aware of possibility or fantasy. And infinitude. Just think of what you and I can do with our psyche. Call it soul, if you will, but with our psyche. It's infinite. How far out can we go? Forever. And it's the infinitude that is a determinant of our soul that leads us directly into a relationship with God the Creator. In contrast, there are the determinants of the body. And they stand in contrast to the determinants of the soul. The body is subject to limitation, to necessity. We have to eat, we have to sleep, to finitude. So we have a contradiction here. Soul, infinitude, body, finitude. That's the paradox of our human identity. And that's the Hebrew Ontology, which is being offered at 950 BCE by some author in the court of King David. It's radical, because it stands in stark contrast to what you see on the other side of the page. What we see here is what, in fact, the world of the J author is experiencing in 950 BCE. A world that is structured by the Babylonian myth of creation called the Enuma Elish. I want to read part of that to you. This is the oldest creation story that's been preserved in the history of human literature. It's dated variously depending on which version of it is being studied, anywhere from 2500 BCE to 1800 BCE. And it stands in stark contrast to this myth of creation that begins in Genesis 2 verse 4a. Before human beings were created, they were human beings. That's what we encounter in the myth of the Anew. Why? Because there are gods. Gods evidently precede human beings, but these gods are related to forces of nature. And if the gods are being identified with forces of nature, there must be human beings around who are doing that kind of thing. But all we learn about is the gods, and the chief one is Marduk, the male deity, the one responsible for all of the patriarchy that has continued right down to the present day. It originated here in the Anew. There are many gods, and some are old and some are young. And the old ones don't like the noise which the young gods are making. And they get quite aroused by it. And that finally leads to a conflict between the gods. And Tiamat, the goddess of the seas, particularly the oceans, and Apsu, the god of the fresh waters, they're related to each other. They start creating monsters of different kinds, and the other gods are exasperated by this kind of creation activity, and so a real civil war erupts between the gods, and Marduk slays Tiamat, and divides her body into 2 parts, and uses one part to create the firmament above, and the other part to create the firmament below. Does that sound familiar? That's in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is priestly Strand. There's a gigantic difference between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, because the priestly Strand is buying into the ontology of separation, which we don't have as yet in the myth of Genesis 2. So, just a few lines. Marduk has a bow. A bow is a weapon of war. And the bow will play a role in the story that follows the flood. Because God has a bow too. A bow that God puts into the sky. A rainbow. That is symbolic of reconciliation. Marduk's bow is an instrument of war. And he uses the bow to kill Tiamat. And as I said, her body is divided into 2 parts. So, in the Babylonian myth of creation, conflict is ontological. Conflict exists before any kind of peace or reconciliation. Conflict is embedded in history, in human existence. So in Genesis 2. Well, it's time to create human beings. And Kingu, who incited the rebellion between the gods, is slain, and his blood is drawn and mixed with clay, and that's the creation of human beings according to the Anew. In other words, human beings are made from divine blood, mixed with clay. And they are created, if I can find the text. Marduk then shapes these human beings out of the blood of Hebrew and clay and designates them to be savages. Human beings, according to the myth of creation, are intended to serve the gods so that the gods can be at ease, they can rest. And subsequently in the Illumination, these savages, these human beings, will construct a tower. Genesis 9, or rather, Genesis 11 will make use of that story, which we call the Tower of Babel. It's taken directly out of the Illumination. It is a vertical structure that is supposed to bring about reconciliation, but through hierarchical relationships and through conflict within the hierarchical relationships. God comes down, inspects this structure that's being erected, and decides this is the wrong thing. This is not good, and God then confuses the one language which the world is speaking at that time, and that separates people from each other, ends the reconciliation of the rainbow, and starts and introduces the old problem all over again. What is the future of the human being in the light of all these things that have happened? Think of Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, their wives. They survived the flood. But what kind of human beings are they? They're identical to Adam and Eve. What Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. So let's look at Genesis 3 and see what's happening there. Just a word or two about where we left off in Genesis 2. The Yahweh God took the man, Adam. We don't have any gender differentiation here yet, although it's male, at least in Hebrew. Put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. And now, God decides it's time to create something other than human beings. So God creates and forms every animal of the field, every bird of the air, vegetation. God brings all the animals to the male, Adam, and stands by as Adam names all these creatures. That's a sovereignty. A sovereignty that you and I are endowed with. A sovereignty to build a world. We use language to build a world. And that's precisely what Adam is doing here by naming the animals. Adam is constituting a reality, the reality of world. And the animals are supposed to be his helper. There's a little reference here probably to a story in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Almost as old as the Illumination. There's a wild man in the Epic of Gilgamesh named Enkidu, who's running with the gazelles and the wild animals. He eats grass with them, drinks at their water holes, and is a nuisance to King Gilgamesh, because whenever Gilgamesh sets traps for these antelopes, which he loves to eat, Enkidu sets them free. And finally, Gilgamesh decides that it's got to change, so he places a prostitute at one of the water holes. And when Enkidu appears, she undresses and lures him into bed for 7 days and 7 nights. And when he returns to the animals, he's rejected. He can't go back to the animals. He's compelled to go into the world of culture. I'm mentioning that too because in the world at this time, the woman should not be identified as the weaker of the genders. The woman is representative of culture. And that's why she's also a prostitute, unfortunately, because of the way in which culture is viewed by many people. The woman who represents it can be like Delilah, that Lord Samson that brought about his eventual destruction. In any case, God creates a helpmeet for Adam by taking a chop out of his side, flesh and blood, shaping it into a woman. And when Adam encounters her, we have a response that contrasts what we read in the Epic of Gilgamesh. When Enkidu dies in the Epic of Gilgamesh, he curses the prostitute who took him away from the animals. In contrast, Adam says, bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And it is Adam who then creates gender. Don't attribute gender to God. God has nothing to do with gender. It is Adam who names this woman Isha over against Ish. That's the beginning of gender. Something that the church, I think, has forgotten for a long, long time. So, they are together in the garden, and the snake appears. And naturally, the snake addresses the woman first, not because she's the weakling, but because she represents culture. It's very natural, therefore, for the snake to address the woman first. And he introduces the problem by posing a question. Did God say, "You shall not eat from any tree in the garden"? And the woman answers almost correctly. She says, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it.'" She adds that on her own. So there's maybe more in the way she understands this than she's supposed to. But the serpent says to the woman, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Now, go back to this for a moment, and just go think back into Genesis 2 and take out the self in this figure. For a moment, take out the self. All that we have is the polarity of soul and body. The man and the woman are in the garden. There are both polarities, soul and body joined together, but there's no self yet. This is the childhood stage of humanity. This is probably where you and I were when we were growing up, and at some point in our lives, we encountered a possibility we've never experienced before. Maybe something very, very fundamental, and we made a decision to have that possibility, to actualize that possibility. And at that moment, you and I became a self. So while the man and the woman are in the garden, they do not have a self, at least until we get to Genesis 3. They don't need a self because they've got everything. They're workers, they've got a garden, they've got fruit trees, and they've got Yahweh walking with them every day. Yahweh is an immediate presence. Just as in here, in this figure, Yahweh is there. But the snake poses a possibility that is very, very attractive. Knowing good and evil. This comes out of the anew. In fact, I'm convinced it goes all the way back to the emergence of Homo sapiens. This is the original ontology. It was necessary when humanity emerged from its earlier stages that it had to acquire knowing good and evil. Knowing is not enough. Knowing good and evil is what gives us stability and security. And probably with the emergence of Homo sapiens, that was a necessity. To build a society that was structured and that had a measure of security. And that is picked up by the anew, and it has continued right down to the present day. We all want to know good and evil. It gives us security. But to know good and evil, we need to have a self. How do we get a self? Well, as the woman probably learned in her response to the snake, she made a decision. You will be like God? Wow, what an infinite possibility! And to know good and evil, to overcome vulnerability. What a tremendous possibility. And she eats the fruit and hands some of it to that partner of hers, who isn't strong enough to take responsibility for what he's doing. Now turn to this ontology. Obviously, it's hierarchical. And that's what happens when a decision is made for a possibility. It necessarily becomes hierarchical. When you and I made a decision, we entered a hierarchical world. Why? Look at what happens to the relationship between soul and body. They're separated. They were not to be separated according to Genesis 2:7. That's a polarity that is embedded in a union. But here, the moment that one chooses to know something, and maybe especially to know good and evil, the soul becomes an interrogating intellect. thinking. Thinking separates the psyche from the body. Necessarily. And that has great advantage. Because then one is free to investigate. One is free to begin to look around and establish knowledge. Knowledge is based on separation, the separation of the psyche from the body. It's a hierarchical relationship. And this is when, and this is important, in Genesis 2:7, that polarity which unites body and soul has being. In other words, the union of that polarity has being, or we could say is being. That's ontological. But here, in the separation, being now is ascribed entirely to the intellect, to the mind, to the psyche that's become reason. God is not necessary in this kind of ontological structure. Look where I put God. God is at the top. God is a vertical or hierarchical reality, as it is in Christianity for the last 2,000 years. This is our ontology in the Christian church, and it's been that way for almost 2,000 years, and maybe 2,000 years. Because we all talk about having a hierarchical relation with Jesus, and that's why Peter can't get out of the boat and walk on the water and join Jesus in doing the godlike thing. And that's why we can't really believe what Jesus says when he tells his disciples, the works that I do, you will do, and greater works than these you will do, because I go to my Father. We can't do that because we're dependent. If we want God at all. We don't need God, because we've got an interrogating intellect. We can find our own way. We don't need to be dependent on anything except ourselves. And it seems as though our society is getting to be like that more and more. But knowing good and evil is a very ambiguous reality. See, this is where we are. This is where we are. We know good and evil. We are thinkers. You have to think in order to know. And it's wonderful that one can know good in this, well, I hesitate to use the word fallen state. It's not, Genesis 3 is not really a fall. What we read in Genesis 3 is what's been going on in history for thousands of years, all the way back to the Anew and all the way back to Homo sapiens. So, when we start thinking, using our intellect to interrogate the world and separate the mind from the body, we are also separating the determinants of the mind from the determinants of the body. They're working differently. In fact, if you and I are thinkers, our psyche is engaged in interrogating the world. What has happened to the determinants of the psyche? in this ontological structure. They're gone. Here you confront the reality of biblical scholarship. This is biblical scholarship to this very day. It's been going on for more than 200 years. It follows this structure because by interrogating the biblical text, let me show you how it works. For a moment, let's suppose I have a subject-object relationship to this bottle of water. I'm the subject, this is the object. And I can interrogate that with my intellect, try to learn as much about that as I can. But of course I can't use it unless I stretch out my hand, take it, and at that moment, this object becomes an extension of my hand. It's part of me. That's not the way biblical scholarship works. There's nothing personal about it. Biblical scholarship takes the biblical text, let's imagine this is now the Bible, it surrounds the biblical text with all kinds of knowledge. Greek, history, sociology, anthropology, all kinds of tools are invented, have been invented over the centuries, and all of it is surrounded around the biblical text. But the biblical text is never touched. It's purely objective. And all that's produced is information in this structure. So, this is Christianity. Christianity using what is its major source, Old and New Testaments. And look where we are, and look what we've been doing for almost 2,000 years. And it's based on separation. Separation of the psyche as the mind or the intellect, separation from the body. And therefore also separation between the determinants of the soul and the determinants of the body. Because, as I tried to say a moment ago, when the psyche becomes an interrogating intellect, it completely loses touch with imagination, with possibility, fantasy, and infinitude. That's what biblical scholarship is. I know that personally because of the kinds of criticism that my writings get from the world of biblical scholarship. Because I use my imagination. And my imagination puts me into the possibilities of the text, and the possibilities are hidden. I need my a priori understanding, this great fountain of experience that has accumulated since I was born. I need all of that to probe the biblical text as I struggle to read it in Greek and make sense of it. But what involves me is not just taking a little piece of Matthew or a little piece of Mark. If you look at the Journal of Biblical Literature sometime and at its table of contents, you see it's all fragmented. Everything is fragmented. Hardly anything is ever done holistically. And to do something holistically, you have to relate the parts to the whole and the whole to the parts. And you need your imagination for that. And you need to look at possibilities. But hopefully always with a critical orientation. That's important too. because there is a lot of subjectivity here in our a priori understanding that may interfere with an interpretation of the biblical text that hopefully will still try to be as scientific as possible. So, this is what Eve is, well, she's not named yet. This is what the woman wants. The knowing good and evil, and the attractive side of that kind of knowing is the possibility of doing good. I mean, if we as Christians are primarily within this ontological structure, we can still do a lot of good. Oh, yes. And we are. I mean, the church is engaged in justice and equality, eliminating poverty, overcoming separation. That's important. Allowing gays and lesbians to be ordained. Marriage, same-sex marriage, all of these things are ways of eliminating the separation that is at the heart of this ontology. So we are doing good. I guess sometimes we lapse into evil, and the church has been guilty of that with its anti-Semitism and its treatment of women and all kinds of other realities that have occurred down through history. All that evil that continues to multiply within the Roman Catholic Church and the way in which it treats its young people. What is Christianity? And how do we ever get to it if all of us are here and if biblical scholarship is here? And biblical scholarship, which treats the source text that we have, continues to pour out information that's very impersonal. And Heidegger, who's one of my favorite philosophers, in spite of what he did in joining the Nazi Party, at least being in time was written before Hitler came into power, but that's probably the most important book that he wrote throughout his life. What Heidegger did in Being in Time was to move us out of pure objectivity, out of this structure, into a little bit of this kind of structure, because Heidegger said, what's up here in the a priori mind, this great fund of knowledge is invaluable for interpretation. In fact, Heidegger maintained that interpretation is the primary reality of everyday existence in the life of human beings. Everything we do from the time we get up in the morning involves this interpretation. So we're using the a priori understanding all the time, and it's wonderful. It's rich. It's imagination. How is it possible then that biblical scholarship still remains within that ontology? And thinking that knowledge, objective scientific knowledge, still is what needs to be promoted, when all it does is continue the morality of separation. Should stop and ask for questions. Yes.
Put yourself in a parish setting for me, if you would. Put yourself in a parish setting, a congregational setting.
Okay.
How would this understanding of vertical as opposed to horizontal ontology, shift how you would preach or how you would pastor?
Well, good question. Very good question. One of the things that I would say in many of the classes, and I thought you may have heard me say it, don't start a service of worship with a confession of sins. If you do that, you're here. Because sin is a reality of separation. And the question is, if you are a Christian, if you identify yourself as a Christian, is that your fundamental ontology? Is that the fountain of your being, that you are separate from God, separate from Jesus? What does it mean to belong to the body of Christ? That's not separation. What a contradiction. And still, across the street, I love Joanne. She's a great pastor. Good preacher. Good preacher. We still start the service with the confession of sins.
So, Joanne Witt, who loves her teacher from her time there, Herman Waetjen, tries to do that, as good as she is. I mean, a successful Manhattan, corporate attorney before she came to Seminary. She's got big stones. But if she tries that, she gets crucified.
Maybe. I don't think it's been tried.
Right. So this is
Howard writes, and I would agree on this one, this very thing, and yet Howard always steered away from it. Because you're right, it's volatile stuff.
right. And we're afraid of, and Joanne's not afraid, but for some reason, it's more important for her to keep that job than it is to follow your teaching. And she would choose.
I'm not sure of that. I think she's got integrity, a lot of integrity.
Yeah.
No question about that at all. She may not. I don't think she knows the difference between these two structures, but then we haven't taught the difference between these two structures at the seminary, have we? I mean, how much of that did you get during your theological education? I've been at this for a long time. I'm still growing into it. I don't want to sit in judgment on anybody. What I'm trying to share with you is the gigantic problems that I have in trying to get through all of this to learn more of what Christianity is supposed to be. And one of the conclusions that I have arrived at is it's not a new religion. It should not be juxtaposed to Judaism. Christianity is Jewish. It came out of Judaism. Matthew's author is a Jew writing to Jews in the city of Antioch of Syria. And what the author of Matthew is doing is telling the Jews to do the same thing that the Apostle Paul had been doing for his whole career, evangelizing the Gentiles. So when Jesus, at the very conclusion of Matthew, says, go into the world and make disciples of all nations, he's telling a Jewish community to evangelize the Gentiles. How do we know that? Here again, we don't count. 11 disciples go to the mountain in Galilee. And Jesus appears before them, and the text, the narrator says, some doubted. I think that doubt reflects not the original historical disciples of Jesus. That doubt reflects the church of the Jewish people in Antioch. And it probably reflects your doubt and my doubt. After all, the resurrection of Jesus is the most preposterous thing that ever happened in history. Is it plausible? But he says to them, all authority in heaven and on earth was given to me. That's taken right out of Daniel. It's an apocalyptic text. And he's speaking as the Son of Man. And here's another problem. The Son of Man is a community, not an individual. biblical scholarship still treats the Son of Man as an individual. Just Jesus and his disciples. And Jesus is speaking to his disciples as though he himself alone has all of this authority in heaven and on earth. And then he proceeds to send them out in the world, and then we have a big problem. The baptismal formula of the Trinity. Oh. It's a tragedy. It was not in the original text, even though all the biblical manuscripts preserve that baptismal Trinitarian formula. There's not a single Greek manuscript that does not include it. But the historian Eusebius of Caesarea quoted this conclusion of Matthew more than 17 times, and there is none of those quotations in which the Trinitarian formula is included. And I've decided Eusebius knows better than the manuscript tradition does, because we don't have complete manuscripts of Matthew prior to the Council of Nicaea, and that's where that Trinitarian formula comes from. It originated in that council in 325. So Jesus may simply be saying, teaching them in my name. And then the last sentence is what consummates the whole gospel, and still it's not translated correctly, but then maybe it would be awkward or difficult to translate the last verse correctly. I am with you all the ways, all the days, even to the consummation of the age. But the Greek text takes the divine ego eimi formula and uses it. Ego, meth, himon, eimi, I with you am all the days, even to the consummation of the age. In other words, 11 males, unfortunately, went up to the mountain in Galilee. 12 came down. The 12th one is Jesus, who joins the 11 to constitute or reconstitute the people of God as a new humanity. And he is a part of that because he was a part of the title Son of Man when he used it throughout the Matthew Gospel. And he who used the ego eimi formula, walking on the sea, now uses it to embrace you and me. And if all authority in heaven and on earth was given to him, it was given to you and me just because we're embraced by his divine ego eimi. So, when you start teaching that to the church, what do you have to do? The minimum would be to take the confession of sins and put it after the sermon and say, we're not separated from God. We're coming. Let me interrupt that for a moment and say, when you and I enter a church building on Sunday morning, the church is not like the temple in Jerusalem that has God's presence already inside of it. If God ever gets into a church building, it's because you and I bring God into it as bearers of the Holy Spirit. So why not celebrate life? Because that's what it's all about. Life, because we're no longer sinners. That's a priority. I taught that for so many years too. Again and again. It never took hold.
That's not true.
Well, maybe it's not true, but I may be speaking far too generally, you know. But let's prioritize that. If Jesus, as the Son of the human being, is co-enthroned with God, that's exactly where you and I are, if we want to use that myth. that kingdom of God, rule of God, is ours. And here's another problem. We end the Lord's Prayer with a doxology, and we commit heresy every time we do that, because the kingdom, the power, and the glory do not belong to God. They belong to you and me, and the Bible says that very specifically. So the Roman Catholic Church at least doesn't include the doxology, but here we pray it every Sunday. And it contradicts everything that is preached from the pulpit, and it simply affirms what we say when we start out with a confession of sins. In other words, I'm talking about restructuring an entire service of worship. Why can't we do that? Gently. But while we're doing that, let people know who they really are. When Paul begins his letters, he calls everyone a holy person. Hagioi. That's the priority. And he may get quite critical about some of the people and some of the things they're doing, but they're still holy. But we still talk about sins as though that's the predominant reality in our lives. And by confessing sins, we are screaming to the world that this is who we are. We're separated from God just like you are. So what is Christianity? How do we get translations? How do we get biblical scholars to translate the biblical text more correctly? So that when lay people read the story of Jesus walking on the sea and identifying himself with the formula that God uses in Exodus 4, and Peter says, well, if that's who you are, then let me join you on this. And that's the destiny that you and I are to be committed to. So, what can a seminary do these days to stay alive? Or what can the church do to counter all of its secularism that sweeps it away? Deborah?
Okay, so I'm a big fan of heresy because I think it's what defines orthodoxy sociologically in the church.
The first part I missed.
I'm a big fan of heresy because I think
heresy. I thought I heard
that. When I came to you with a heresy, but I'm also a big fan of Phyllis Tickle. You know Phyllis Tickle's work as a historian, and her image that is so powerful to me these days is that every 500 years the church goes through a rummage sale and shifts things. You know, you start with the disruptor, Jesus, and I don't need to do the history lesson, but we're at that point right now. And my work in adaptive change with congregations is that horizontal understanding of ontology is much more prevalent in the pew than it is in the pulpit.
There you go.
Already.
I don't hear it, but then I may not be tuned in as I should.
I think we scared them off from talking. I think it exists, in part because their faith is more secularized.
Well, if it exists, then let's start using it. Let's start.
Yeah, I agree. And if we look at the decline of the church I'll just even take in America, let alone the Western world, the possibility of that younger generation that has no need for a church in their life isn't poisoned by that. And so to go back to the well at a time of shifting in the church and embracing the horizontal understanding, it's there in a lot of, people denigrate it and are now willing to embrace that West Coast phrase, spiritual but not religious. And I think in the midst of that, we have a couple of generations, maybe 1.5 generations so far, that are looking at it and saying, yeah, I don't buy that crap. But I buy this experience. My experience has taught me that God is in nature. My experience has taught me that, you know, that this makes sense, this doesn't. And I'm reminded that when I was at our next church conference, which is a sort of progressive group in the denomination, they had a worship service that I wasn't attending. I was out in the corridors, and they started this chant that was antiphonal, and it was, the church is dying, thanks be to God. Constantly. And then, of course, being millennials, they tweeted it out and all hell broke loose. The church is dying, thanks be to God. But it was that version of church that they were pushing against.
And the baggage which the church brings out of the past. And there's a lot of baggage that's worthless. Because a lot of the baggage buys into the, I was going to say ontology, the morality of separation. Think of Augustine, doctrine of original sin. There's separation already when we were in our mother's uterus. And we continue to be sinners, we continue to be separated from God throughout our life to the very time we die. Separation, for Augustine, is the ultimate reality in creation. And Luther and Calvin both bought into that completely. I mean, I don't know how far back you want to push it, but I'm ready to say 2,000 years of church history are a big mistake. I'm speaking very generally. There are good things, but there are a lot of bad things, a lot of evil that has been done. And why can't we say to the world, we're letting go of that baggage. This is a reformation that's beginning now. Their young people are tuned into it already, perhaps to a certain extent. Let's join the people out there who may be ahead of us. And let's see what we can do together. But I don't see the people who govern the church eager to move into this.
And I think that's the key. People who govern the church. And the money. As a Methodist, I'm only 2 steps removed from Roman Catholicism. And, you know, we might as well have a vote. We act like we have a vote. We function like we have a vote. We call them bishops and so on. But radically, the ideas you're coming up with are such that I think the only way we can preach is through storytelling.
Can you say that again?
The only way we can preach is through storytelling.
Yes, sure.
You know, I sat down one day after I'd been preaching for 25 or so years, and I thought, all the stuff I learned in seminary, I liked it. It was enjoyable. I don't preach anymore. I just tell a story or two. Does it make any difference? I don't know.
Well, you don't have to worry about it as long as you're telling the story.
It's just a story. Well,
Work for Jesus.
yes, me too. And the other thing I realized was I almost never use New Testament texts. I began meaning more and more stuff out of what we call the Old Testament. Our tradition is called Old
Yeah,
Testament.
we've done injustice to the Old Testament.
We really have.
You know, that's why I'm thrilled when I'm learning about Genesis 2 and Genesis 3 and sort of shoving Genesis 1 away. I don't want anything to do with Genesis 1. That's separation. Separation. That's priestly stuff.
I was going to say, I think the one thing I would struggle with, yeah, maybe it's a misunderstanding, is when you have the creation one where God is more on a level with us. I think in some ways that people don't like or need the idea of God as somehow as distant from us, but I think there is a need to feel that God is greater than us, or has, you know, if you say we can do the same, that there's sort of a need to think of when humans can't solve something, when things on earth can't quite something, or when things are despairing on earth, that God is above us in a way that it's not putting us down, but then God has that power to take care of us and do things. And I guess that understanding of hierarchy is, I think, something that is comforting to people. And it's not separation. It's not that we're separated from God. It's just
But we're separated. We're separated. But don't get rid of the separation. Verticality implies separation. It's dependency. And maybe that's a comfortability that people love. But maybe that's not what it means to be a human being. We've got two ontologies. Which one do we want? But in 1 Corinthians 15:45, Paul differentiates these two ontologies. The first Adam became a nefesh naya, a living soul. He goes all the way back to Genesis 2. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. That's the real identity. Paul is talking about humanity. When he uses the word Adam, he's talking about a humanity. There was the first humanity, and now there's the new humanity. And the new humanity consists of life-giving spirits. Well, Kierkegaard has played a very important role in my reading and my thinking. And as you may know, Arnold Kuhn, when he retired from the presidency, got himself involved more deeply in the writings of Kierkegaard. He learned Danish and he read everything that Kierkegaard wrote in Danish and wrote two authentically great volumes on Kierkegaard's philosophy. I wish Arnold were still alive. I need to talk to him. I need to talk to him on the basis of the books that he read. But he regards Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death, which is, I think, his last work, Kierkegaard's last work, to be the greatest of all the writings that Kierkegaard produced. And there's a formula in The Sickness Unto Death that's very relevant here, and that could be used in what we're talking about. Arnold translates it very well. The self is a relationship which relates to itself. The self is a relationship which relates to itself. For a moment, again, remove the self out of this polarity. We have a relationship of soul and body, or psyche and body. And that relationship has a relationship. Or to put it differently, the self that you and I have as Christians is embedded in the union of soul and body, or psyche and body. And as such, we have a relationship, as this figure shows, a relationship that goes towards human beings and creation, nature, and a relationship that goes towards God. That's a good formula. The self is a relationship which relates to itself. Now, what is that relationship like? Is it a relationship of separation, or is it a relationship of union? At the end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, Jesus says to his disciples, pray for your enemies, love your enemies, pray for them, and be like God, who lets the sun shine on the wicked and the good, and the rain fall on the just and the unjust. Hey, there's no separation. And we're supposed to be like God. But just think of what that does for us if we open ourselves up to that kind of a world where we don't separate ourselves from anything or anybody. We become the most vulnerable people this kind of ontology. So, can we afford that? Can we be so strong in our trust? I'm rejecting the word faith. I don't like faith. Faith is a dependent relationship. You have faith because you're dependent on God. Trust is a two-way street. I trust God, God trusts me. That's what's happening in the story of Abraham. Our time is almost up. I need to say just a little something about Abraham because that's the most incredible story in the Old Testament after Genesis 2 and 3. Abraham has gotten to Haran, and God calls him to go to a place which I will show you. Open-ended. And then God warrants a string of possibilities. Whoa, I will make you great. I will bless you. You will be blessed by others. Those who curse you, I will curse. Those who bless you, I will bless. I will make you a great nation. All the families of the earth will be blessed by you. Well, that's a ridiculous possibility for Abraham because he's not going to live long enough even for a great nation to come out of his life or marriage. And certainly a lot of centuries have to go by before Abraham can somehow be a blessing to all the peoples of the earth. And those are the possibilities that God warrants Abraham. And then we come to the climactic episode in which he calls upon Abraham to sacrifice his son. And that deserves a lot of reflection in the light of everything that we've said here this afternoon. Because it's such a misunderstood story, and even Kierkegaard, who focuses on that in Fear and Trembling, did not understand it. Kierkegaard focuses on the sacrifice of Abraham. But in the story, God is sacrificing himself just as Abraham is sacrificing his son. God is canceling God's godness out just as Abraham is eliminating the future of his life. All the promises that God warranted to him when he left Haran, all of those are now being terminated when he is now called to kill his son. And he really does psychologically. Because as he gets ready to plunge that knife into his son's body, he is so committed to it that at the last minute, an angel of God has to call out and say, stop. That was the moment when God and Abraham became one because they had both sacrificed their being. It's hard to understand. But that story plays itself out in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In other words, here we have an image that will finally be fulfilled many centuries later when Abraham's journey is finally ended on the cross and in the resurrection. That's a different understanding of Christianity. I got 2 minutes yet. Thank you, Marissa. I just want to go back to Matthew. I wanted to finish. The number 2, soul and body. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is a self who has a soul and a body, just like you and me. As a soul, or a psyche, Jesus is Christologically labeled Son of God and Son of Man, or Son of the human being. And that's a corporate title. Son of God may be individual, Son of Man is corporate. That relates to Jesus' Christological identity throughout the gospel in relation to his being as a soul or as a psyche. His body, however, is ethnic. His soul has a universal orientation. His body, like your body and mine, is ethically determined. I'm German. I was born in Germany. I'm ethically determined just like you are. And the titles that Jesus bears ethically are Son of David and Messiah. So we've got two trajectories, two Christological trajectories related to this duality, to this polarity that we've been talking about. And they work dialectically throughout the gospel. Jesus is both of these realities, both of these identities, because soul and body are dialectically related to each other. And that's who you and I are. As souls, we're universally oriented. There's no separation. As bodies, we're ethically determined. And then we have to decide how we're going to relate to the bodies when we are ethically determined. Am I going to be Germanically oriented all my life? No, there's a dialectical relation. And it relates to one more polarity, which I leave you with to think about. Identity and otherness. Soul, mind, on the one hand, and with that, the identity that you and I have as souls and minds. And on the other hand, the body has its relationship to difference and otherness. We live in a world of identity and otherness, and it's playing itself out in Washington, D.C., and throughout the country in a horrible fashion, but then throughout the world as well. Tribalism, separation. We need the Old and the New Testaments to teach us what Christianity is about.